Thanks for tuning in to the Boulder Bookstore Author Q&A. My name is Thomas Wolfe, and I'm the author of The Called Shot, Babe Ruth, the Chicago Cubs, and the unforgettable Major League Baseball season of 1932. Boulder Bookstore has given me a series of questions to respond to so that I can tell you a little bit about The Called Shot and the writing of that book. Here's the first question. What inspired you to write The Called Shot? I would say two things: a love of baseball and a love of American history. I've been a baseball fan for a long time. I collected baseball cards in the 1950s. As I've gotten older, I've gotten more interested in the history of baseball, especially in the early part of the 20th century, and in particular, the decades of the 1920s and 1930s. One reason for that is those are the decades in which Babe Ruth played. And so part of my inspiration in writing this book was also an opportunity to research and write about Babe Ruth. 1932 baseball was different than it is today. There was no team located farther west than St. Louis, no team located farther south than Washington, D.C. So baseball was being played at the major league level, mostly in the Midwest and the upper East, the Northeast. Games were played in about 2 hours. Teams traveled by train, not by airplane, and there were no night games. So the whole game of baseball and the way it was experienced by fans was considerably different in 1932 than it is today. Next question. What is The Called Shot about? The book starts with a prologue that describes Babe Ruth as a pitcher for the Boston Red Sox pitching against the Chicago Cubs in the 1918 World Series. And then the book jumps ahead 14 years to 1932, and the 1932 season is told as a narrative starting in spring training and going through the World Series in October of that year. So it's a story of the season from the beginning to the end. Why 1932? Well, that's a good question, and one I've been asked before. Out of all the seasons in the 1920s and 1930s, why pick this particular year? And there are really three main reasons for me. The pennant races were very interesting. The New York Yankees won going away in the American League. They won 107 games. They were by far the most dominant team in the major leagues. The National League was completely different. It was a multi-team race all the way to the end, and the Chicago Cubs, despite considerable adversity, their shortstop was shot by his girlfriend in the middle of the season. Their owner died before the season began. Their player manager, Rogers Hornsby, was fired in August in the middle of a pennant race. But the Cubs were able to overcome those various difficulties and emerge as the National League champions. It was also a season in which a lot of the greatest players of Major League Baseball participated. Ruth and Gehrig, of course, in the New York Yankees. Rogers Hornsby, who I've mentioned. Philadelphia Athletics had a terrific team led by players like Lefty Grove, Al Simmons, and Jimmy Fox. 1932 was the rookie year for a fellow named Dizzy Dean, and his story is part of the book also. I might also add that Jimmy Fox's 1932 season, in which he hit 58 home runs and drove in 169 runs, was one of the most remarkable seasons any major league player has had in the history of the sport. And even though his Athletics did not win the pennant, Fox's great year is something that I did want to write about and comes through in the Called Shot. Next question is, what were some of the dramatic events going on in the summer of 1932 that you write about in The Called Shot? And this question goes to what's going on in the country, not so much in Major League Baseball. 1932, of course, America was a pivotal year for America because of the Great Depression, the number of people who were jobless and homeless, and the fact that there were demonstrations in Washington, D.C. almost all summer long by the Bonus Army. And it was a presidential election year, so that Americans had to choose whether or not they wanted 4 more years of Herbert Hoover or the New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt. And I should note that Hoover and Roosevelt play a part in the book. Both of them are featured. Hoover was a terrific very devout baseball fan, threw out the first pitch to get the season started back in April. And in October, Franklin Roosevelt, on a campaign trip, stopped in Chicago in order to see Game 3, the most famous game of the season. Stopped to see his beloved New York Yankees play the Chicago Cubs. And Franklin Roosevelt had box seats right behind the New York Yankees dugout. And although he was a Yankees fan, he was given the honor of throwing out the first pitch to start game 3. So a lot of American history was happening during the same time that the baseball season was being played in 1932. Next question, what famous thing happened in that Game 3 of the 1932 World Series? The Yankees had won the first two games of the series, 12-6 and 5-2 in New York. So the scene shifted to Chicago and to Wrigley Field, and the crowd swelled to about 50,000 people who were able to cram into Wrigley Field, and that included Governor Roosevelt and his entourage. It included the mayor of Chicago, Anton Cermak, the commissioner of baseball, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, and many, many rabid and devoted Chicago Cubs fans. The game was tied at 4-4 in the top of the fifth inning when Babe Ruth came to bat against Charlie Root. Now, Charlie Root was the Cubs' best pitcher. He still holds the record for the most wins of any pitcher in Cubs history. So it was a pivotal at bat in that game and in the series. The count went to 2-2, 2 balls, 2 strikes. Ruth didn't swing at any of those pitches. And after that fourth pitch, Ruth turned to the home plate umpire and said, if the pitcher puts the next one over the plate, I'm going to hit it out of here. And that's what happened. On the fifth pitch of that at bat, Ruth homered into the right center field bleachers. The longest home run anybody remembered that it had been hit at Wrigley Field to that date. Now, the controversy about that particular at bat is whether or not Ruth actually called his shot, because during the at bat, Ruth was waving his arms, he was pointing, he was carrying on a fairly heated conversation with Cubs in the dugout. It was quite a dramatic scene at the plate during that single at bat. And I might note that in Ruth's career, he had more than 10,000 at bats, and this particular at bat in the fifth inning against Charlie Root is the most scrutinized at bat of Ruth's career, and maybe the most scrutinized at bat in all of baseball history. I actually devote 2 chapters in the book to talking about what happened at the plate and how fans and players and sports reporters commented on and thought about that at bat in the years afterwards. Next question, what kind of research did you do for the book? I worked over 10 years on the book in terms of doing the research and then the writing. I did a lot of it online. I was able to get all of the Cubs and Yankees box scores and game reports. I read biographies of the players who participated in 1932 baseball, read oral histories from that era, and I spent a lot of time at the National Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York, going through their archive. So I had a great deal of material to work with in order to be able to tell the story of the 1932 season. The next question is, what books did you read during the pandemic that you really loved? Well, I finished writing The Called Shot a few months before the pandemic. I hadn't settled on a new writing project at that time. So I did some rereading of books that I had loved in the past. I actually reread one of the Ruth biographies that I had used in my research, a book called The Big Fella by Jane Levy. I reread a book called Seabiscuit by Lauren Hillenbrand, which has always been one of my favorite nonfiction books. And I read fiction. I read the novels of Kent Harif. I read the short stories of Stuart Dybek. So that's the reading I did, at least early in the pandemic before I began working on another writing project. Final question is there anything else you want us to know about your book? I would say just simply, if you like baseball and if you like American history, you will like The Called Shot. The book is available in various formats. It is in nearly 600 libraries. And if you want to purchase a copy, I would strongly urge you to do so at your local independent bookstore, like the Boulder Bookstore, which has been so generous in providing me the opportunity to talk to you today about the fabulous and really thrilling 1932 baseball season. Thanks very much.